The unforgiving wind was a constant biting companion that winter, a ceaseless howl that clawed at the walls of my isolated cabin. My name is Gideon Thorne, and for 45 years this land had been my life, my love, and my constant trial. I wasn't a preacher. I was a rancher, a man whose hands were gnarled and calloused from a lifetime of mending fences, birthing calves in the freezing dark, and burying the dead. I'd seen life and death in equal measure, but never before had I felt the world as brutally cold as it did that season. It wasn't just the snow piled in drifts against the barn doors or the way my breath turned to ice on the frigid air. The cold had settled deep inside me, a profound and weary disillusionment with the human race. I'd spent my life believing in a simple, fundamental truth, that people, for all their flaws, were tethered to a core of decency, that at the heart of every soul was a flicker of something good. But as the years bled into one another, filled with broken promises and petty betrayals, that truth had felt like a lie I was telling myself. I felt like a man tending to a dying flock, not on my ranch, but in my own soul. The silence of the long winter nights, once a comfort, had become a heavy, hollow thing, amplifying the quiet ache of my solitude. On that particular afternoon, the sky was a bruised, heavy gray, threatening more snow. My shoulders ached from chopping firewood, a monotonous labor that did little to quiet the turmoil in my mind. Instead of returning to the deceptive warmth of my hearth, I felt an inexplicable pull to walk. I had no destination, only a desperate need to put one foot in front of the other to find some kind of answer in the stark, unyielding landscape. The snow crunched under my heavy boots, a rhythmic protest against the stillness. The air was so sharp it felt like it was scraping the inside of my lungs. I walked for what felt like hours, the only living thing in a world of white and gray, until a faint, broken sound pierced the heavy quiet. It was a low, guttural moan, a sound so tinged with raw agony that it resonated deep within my bones. It seemed to come from an abandoned barn on the edge of my property, a dilapidated structure I'd long since given up on. The place was little more than a ghost of a building, its planks warped and weathered, its doors hanging precariously on rusted hinges. Folks in town whispered about it, a place haunted by restless spirits, or maybe just the bitter memories of a life that had long since ended. But this sound, this broken whimper, was undeniably human. My rancher's instincts to investigate warred with a profound weariness. Part of me, the part that had watched the world get colder, just wanted to turn away, to go home and pretend I hadn't heard anything. Let someone else deal with the suffering. But the moans persisted, a desperate, fragile plea cutting through the stillness. A grim purpose hardened in my weary soul. I pushed the rotting barn door open, and a cloud of icy dust billowed into the cold air. The interior was a cavern of deep, unforgiving shadows. Motes of dust danced in the slivers of weak winter light that pierced the gaps in the walls. The air inside was still and stale, heavy with the scent of old hay, decay, and something else. Something metallic and sharp. A smell I knew well from tending to wounded animals. My eyes, slow to adjust to the dimness, finally found her. She lay crumpled amidst the scattered hay, her wrists and ankles bound tightly with rough rope. Her simple blue dress was torn and stained, clinging to an emaciated frame. A blossoming dark stain, undeniably, blood-marred the fabric of her skirt, spreading outwards from her right thigh. Her hair, the color of dried winter straw, was matted with grime and sweat, clinging to a face contorted in pain. Her eyes, wide and unfocused, flickered towards me. For a moment I saw a flash of pure terror, but it was quickly replaced by a desperate, fragile hope. My breath hitched in my throat. The sight was a brutal rupture in the quiet monotony of my life. I knelt, my hands trembling as I reached for her. "Ma'am," I managed my voice, a rough, unfamiliar sound. Are you hurt bad?" She flinched at my touch, a low whimper escaping her lips. Her eyes, though clouded with pain, held a sharp, raw intelligence. She tried to speak, her voice a reedy whisper, barely audible above the frantic pounding of my own heart. "Please, don't lift my skirt," she begged. The words were a plea, a desperate fragment of modesty in the face of unimaginable horror. But the dark, spreading stain on her skirt, the sheer volume of blood, screamed a more urgent truth. It was a wound that needed immediate attention. A life was hanging precariously in the balance. My mind, usually focused on the abstract debates of my own lonely existence, became terrifyingly, singularly clear. I saw only the blood, the thread of life, ebbing away into the frozen dirt. Her whispered plea, though it tore at me, was overridden by a primal, instinctive need to assess the damage, to stop the flow. With a profound sense of violation, yet driven by an unyielding necessity, My fingers, calloused from years of gripping reins and shovels, carefully gently lifted the hem of her bloodied skirt. The instant the fabric rose, revealing the pale skin of her upper thigh, I felt the last vestiges of my faith in humanity shatter and crumble into dust. There etched into her flesh with a brutal, precise hand, a raw, angry wound that pulsed with a deep crimson were words. Not a random slash, not a chaotic injury, but a deliberate, chilling message carved deep into her skin. Stark and unyielding were the words she saw too much. The cold, brutal inscription was a punch to the gut, a betrayal of everything I had ever believed. It wasn't just a wound. It was a declaration, a mark of ownership, a testament to a cruelty so profound it defied comprehension. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was calculated, terrifying. The blood, the pain, the terror in her eyes, it all coalesced into a horrifying tableau that stripped away my illusions, leaving me exposed to the raw, festering reality of human depravity. My silenced belief in the decency of man didn't just falter. It died a swift, agonizing death, suffocated by the sheer evil manifested before me. How could I believe in a just and benevolent humanity when such malice existed so brazenly etched into innocent flesh? The righteous indignation I had once felt for the small injustices of the world felt like a cruel joke. But in that instant, as my faith in the natural order of things collapsed, something else, something far more potent and real, began to stir within me. It wasn't a calling from some benevolent power, but a fierce earthly purpose. The truth of her suffering, the undeniable reality of her pain, and the horror of what had been done to her, ignited a fire in the ashes of my shattered beliefs. I was no longer a weary, aimless rancher. I was simply a man confronted by an atrocity, and I saw a clear, singular path forward. I would not leave her. I would not turn away. I would not retreat into my hollow solitude. I would act. I would care for her. I would protect her. "We need to get you out of here," I said. My voice was now firm, stripped of its former weariness, imbued with a newfound resolve that surprised even myself. I began to carefully, meticulously untie the ropes binding her. My movements were precise despite the tremor in my hands. My eyes fixed on her face conveyed a silent promise. I wasn't a savior. I was simply someone who would stay. I would carry her if I had to. Back to my small, modest cabin, the very place that had once been a prison for my isolated spirit, and now would become a sanctuary for her shattered body and spirit. This was the beginning of my transformation, the silent, profound shift from a man who had only tended to his own despair, to a man who would live a truth however brutal, however dangerous. I would choose Maribel Kane's truth carved in blood and pain over the comforting lies of my past. The thin winter sunlight that pierced the cabin's single window illuminated the quiet, relentless work of my hands. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light and the slow, arduous mending of Maribel Kane. I moved with a practiced, almost solemn grace, my large hands surprisingly gentle as I tended to her wounds. On that first night, I had stripped away her blood-soaked, tattered clothes, revealing a canvas of purple and black crisscrossed with angry red gashes and the chilling, deliberate marks of a heated iron. A crudely branded M for Mason Graves marred her left shoulder, a stark testament to the cruelty she had endured. I knew without being told that this was a warning, a declaration of ownership. Each morning I would heat water over the fire, and then carefully, painstakingly, I would wash her wounds. The first few times she flinched, a low moan escaping her lips, but my touch was firm yet feather-light, my gaze steady, unwavering, offering no pity, only a quiet resolve. I cleaned the raw flesh-applied poultices made from herbs I foraged from the nearby woods, the same herbs I used for my livestock, and rebandaged her, my fingers brushing against her skin. Each contact was a silent acknowledgement of her pain and my commitment. I cooked simple, nourishing broths, spoon-feeding her when she was too weak, watching as the tremors in her hands slowly subsided. At night, I would sit by her makeshift bed, a worn blanket draped over my shoulders, listening to her ragged breathing, the occasional whimper that escaped her lips as nightmares clawed at her sleep. I was a silent sentinel, a guardian against the lingering shadows of her torment. Maribel, initially a shell of a woman barely stirring, began to stir. Her eyes, once clouded with pain and fear, started to hold a flicker of awareness, then a weary curiosity. She watched me, her gaze following my movements as I stoked the fire, cleaned the cabin, or simply sat lost in thought. The silence between us was not empty. It was a canvas upon which our shared reality was painted thick with unspoken questions and a fragile, nascent trust. One afternoon as I changed her dressings, my fingers tracing the edge of the M on her shoulder, her voice raspy from disuse broke the quiet. They wanted me to forget. I paused, my eyes meeting hers. I waited. I saw them, she continued, her voice gaining a fragile strength. Mason Graves and his men. They were doing something with the land deeds. Swindling, forging. I saw the papers, the real ones, and I heard them talking about the old man, Mr. Abernathy, how they'd gotten his ranch. He just died. They said it was suicide, but I heard them laugh. They killed him. Her voice hitched a wave of revulsion passing over her face. They saw me, Gideon. Mason said. She knew too much. He wanted me to tell him who else knew who I told. I hadn't told anyone. They kept asking over and over. They would have killed me. Clyde was going to, but he said Mason wanted to make an example. They wanted to make sure I'd never speak again, never forget who did it, who they were. She trailed off, her eyes fixed on the distant wall, reliving the terror. If you hadn't found me, I would have been just another body for the coyotes. I simply nodded, my expression grim. I didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. I simply listened, absorbing her words, the truth of her suffering settling deep within me. The world outside, the one where I had only worried about my own ranch and my own quiet despair, felt impossibly far away, irrelevant. Here in this small, isolated cabin, humanity was in the quiet act of healing, in the steady pulse of a life being rekindled. Days continued to pass, each one bringing Maribel a little more strength, a little more color back to her cheeks. She started to move about the cabin, slowly at first, then with more purpose. The silence between us, once heavy with pain, began to lighten, filled now with the quiet rhythm of two lives intertwined, a shared history in the making. There was an unspoken understanding that transcended words, a bond forged in the crucible of fear and salvation. Maribel saw not a savior in me, but someone who simply stayed. And I in turn saw a truth in Maribel that resonated deeper than any conviction I had ever held. One late afternoon, the sun dipping below the horizon, painting the small kitchen in hues of orange and purple, Maribel stood by the cast-iron stove stirring a pot of stew. Her movements were still a little stiff but fluid, a stark contrast to the broken figure I had found. I sat at the small wooden table, cleaning the bore of my rifle, the familiar scent of oil and metal filling the air. The silence stretched comfortable, alive with the crackle of the fire and the gentle bubbling of the stew. Maribel turned, a faint wisp of steam rising from the pot. Her eyes, no longer haunted, met mine across the small space. There was a directness in her gaze that made my breath catch. I felt a shift within me, a subtle tremor that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a burgeoning feeling I hadn't dared to name. "Is it hard to focus?" she asked, her voice soft, barely a whisper, yet it cut through the quiet like a blade. Her eyes lingered on mine, a knowing glint within them. My hand stilled on the rifle. The question hung in the air, loaded, not with curiosity about my task, but about the unspoken tension that hummed between us. I looked at her, truly looked at her, at the faint scars that still marked her skin, at the strength that had returned to her eyes, at the undeniable pull I felt towards her. The words of my old bitter life, the despair and isolation, felt like hollow echoes, meaningless. All that mattered was the here and now, the truth of this woman standing before me. "You make it seem easy to forget everything," I replied, my voice rougher than I intended, raw with an honesty I had long suppressed. I laid the rifle down, the click of metal against wood resonating in the quiet room. I stood slowly, deliberately, my gaze never leaving hers. The masks I had worn for years, the weathered rancher, the man alone with his disappointments, fell away, crumbling into dust. What remained was simply Gideon, stripped bare, exposed. I walked towards her, the few steps across the small kitchen, feeling like a journey of 1,000 miles. The air thickened with unspoken desire, with the shared weight of our pasts, and the undeniable promise of a future that was just beginning to take shape. I reached her, my hand gently cupping her jaw, my thumb brushing against the faint scar near her temple. In her eyes I saw not a victim but a survivor, a woman who had pulled me from the wreckage of my own self-deception. This was my truth now. This palpable connection, this raw, undeniable pull. My old life was gone, replaced by the fierce, quiet conviction that Maribel Kane was my new beginning. The fragile peace that had settled over the small cabin was a temporary reprieve, a breath held before the inevitable storm. For weeks, Maribel and I had carved out a semblance of life from the dust and silence. Our shared trauma had become a strange binding force. I, no longer a rancher bound by the solitary rhythm of my days, had found a new terrifying purpose in Maribel's eyes. I had chosen her truth, and with it a path I never imagined. Maribel, her body a canvas of scars from a past she couldn't outrun, had found in me not a savior but someone who simply stayed a quiet anchor in her storm-tossed existence. But the quiet was about to shatter. A distant rumble, faint at first, then growing into the thunder of hooves, tore through the midday stillness. A plume of dust, thick and ominous, rose on the horizon, painting a grim line against the vast gray sky. 3 figures emerged from the swirling haze, riding hard, their silhouettes growing larger with every beat of the earth. Clyde, impulsive and quick to draw, led the charge, his hat pulled low. Beside him rode Rhea, a lean, watchful man, and a third burly figure whose face was a mask of grim determination. They were the hounds Mason Graves had unleashed, though the cruel, calculating leader himself was absent, his malevolent will echoing in their every stride. Graves believed fear was the quickest route to silence, and he aimed to silence Maribel for good. Their shouts, guttural and laced with menace, carried on the wind long before their faces were clear. "Maribel Kane, we know you're in there. Mason wants his pound of flesh." Clyde's voice, raw and grating, ripped through the air, a declaration of war. I, a man transformed, stood on the cabin's small porch. The weathered rifle, once a tool for hunting game, felt impossibly light in my hands. My heart, against all expectations, was calm, a quiet pool in the face of the approaching storm. The man who once was a solitary rancher was gone, replaced by a resolve as hard and unyielding as the plains themselves. This was not about personal safety or even justice. This was about protecting the only truth I had left. Maribel appeared beside me, a silent, formidable presence. Her movements were fluid, devoid of hesitation. In her hand a glint of steel, her hunting knife sharpened to a razor's edge. Her eyes, usually haunted, now burned with a cold, clear fire. The look of someone who had walked through the deepest hell and emerged, not unscathed but unbroken. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. She had faced worse than these men, and she would face them again. The first shot cracked a desperate warning from Clyde's pistol, kicking up a spray of ice and dust near my boots. It was a mistake. My response was immediate, an instinct honed by necessity rather than practice. The rifle barked a sharp, concussive report that cut through the frozen air. Clyde, still in full stride, lurched violently. His galloping horse bucked and his body snapped back as if yanked by an invisible rope. He tumbled from the saddle, hitting the frozen ground with a sickening thud, his momentum carrying him in a brief, graceless slide before he lay still, a rapidly expanding dark stain blooming on his chest. The first wolf had fallen. Rhea, seeing Clyde drop, veered sharply, abandoning the direct assault. He spurred his horse around the cabin, aiming for the less visible rear entrance, a desperate flanking maneuver. He was quick, but Maribel was quicker. She moved like a shadow, slipping from the porch, her bare feet silent on the packed earth. She knew every inch of this land, every crevice, every blind spot. She was waiting, a predator in her own right. When Rhea dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a soft crunch, he barely had time to register the dark shape that materialized from the cabin's shadow. Maribel was on him in a blur, her knife a silver flash in the sun. Rhea gasped, a choked, gurgling sound as the blade found its mark deep in his throat. His hands flew up, clawing uselessly at the hilt, his eyes wide with a terror that lasted only a few agonizing seconds before he slumped forward lifeless, his blood seeping into the dry, cold soil. The third man, witnessing the swift, brutal demise of his companions, roared in a primal fury. He abandoned his horse, charging me with a guttural cry, a desperate, animalistic assault. He was a mountain of a man, fueled by rage and a desperate need for vengeance. I met him on the ground, dropping the rifle, knowing the fight had moved beyond bullets. The man lunged, a wild swing aimed at my head. I ducked the blow, whistling past my ear, and countered with a hard, short jab to the gut. It barely fazed the brute. The fight devolved into a brutal, visceral dance of fists and grunts. We wrestled, locked in a desperate struggle, ice and dirt rising in a cloud around us. The man was stronger, but I was faster, fueled by a cold, unwavering resolve. I took a punch to the jaw that staggered me but didn't break me. I saw an opening, a brief flicker of vulnerability in the man's eyes as he wound up for another devastating blow. I moved inside the arc, grabbing the man's head with both hands with a savage, guttural roar that was alien even to my own ears. I twisted, putting every ounce of my transformed strength into the motion. A sickening crack echoed, followed by a wet, tearing sound. I didn't let go. I kept twisting, kept pushing my knuckles, grinding against bone and cartilage until the man's struggle ceased, his body going limp. I didn't stop until the face was a pulpy, unrecognizable ruin, until the silence was absolute and permanent. I stood over the fallen man, breathing heavily, my chest heaving. but my eyes were clear, devoid of remorse. The rancher was truly gone. Maribel emerged from the shadows at the rear of the cabin, her knife still clutched in her hand, a single drop of blood tracing a path down the polished steel. Her gaze met mine, a silent understanding passing between us. No words were needed. We had faced the wolves, and we had become something else entirely, something harder, something ruthless, forged in the crucible of our shared struggle. The peace was still fragile, but it was ours, defended by blood and an unflinching resolve. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the cold wind, carrying away the dust and the echoes of violence. The ground was littered with bodies, a grim testament to the new terrifying nature of Gideon Thorne and Maribel Kane. We had survived, and in doing so had irrevocably changed. The moon, a sliver of bone against the vast inky canvas of the night sky, offered little illumination as Maribel and I toiled. The frozen ground, stubborn and unwilling, yielded slowly to the bite of our shovels. Each scoop of earth, each dull thud as it landed beside the growing excavation, was a testament to the brutal reality of the past few hours. The air, still thick with the lingering scent of gunpowder and fear, felt heavy, pressing down on us. We worked in a grim, wordless rhythm, the only sounds the scrape of metal on dirt and our own labored breaths. First we moved Clyde, his body surprisingly light, yet heavy with the weight of the violence he embodied. I grunted with effort. Maribel, despite her smaller frame, proved an equal, unyielding partner. Her movements precise, devoid of hesitation, a stark contrast to the tremors that still occasionally ran through my own limbs. There was no pity in her eyes, only a grim determination to finish what had begun. Then came his throat, a gaping, silent accusation against the stillness of the night. Burying him was a further confirmation of Maribel's desperate, efficient brutality, a truth I had witnessed firsthand and now helped conceal. Finally, Mason Graves, the architect of Maribel's suffering, his face frozen in a rictus of surprise and pain, was lowered into the cold embrace of the earth. I felt no triumph, only a profound weariness, a deep-seated ache that went beyond the physical strain. The act of burying these men, these specters of a life we had both been forced to confront, was a final, chilling ritual. It was not justice we sought, but erasure. A burying not just of bodies, but of the very notion that our lives could ever return to what they once were. Each handful of dirt thrown over the shallow graves felt like a nail hammered into the coffin of our past. Hours later, as the first faint blush of pre-dawn light began to paint the eastern horizon, we stood over the freshly turned earth, indistinguishable mounds against the dark landscape. I wiped sweat from my brow with a grimy hand, my gaze sweeping over the horizon. The distant mountains, usually a beacon of solid permanence, now seemed a monument to a hollow pretense. A life I had worn like an ill-fitting suit. I had tended this land day after day, year after year, believing in a truth I now knew to be a lie. My faith, a bedrock laid deep in my soul, remained. It was not in a distant god I had abandoned, but the performance, the facade of a man untouched by the brutal realities of the world. I had seen Maribel's scars, felt the raw edge of her pain, witnessed the depths of human depravity and the fierce, unyielding will to survive. I had faced my own capacity for decisive action, for standing firm against evil. I was no longer just Gideon Thorne the rancher. I was Gideon, a man made of flesh and truth, irrevocably changed, stripped bare of the comfortable lies I had once told myself. The words of my old life, once a source of comfort, now felt like ash in my mouth. I could not return to my chores, could not stand before my herd and speak of peace. When my hands remembered the heft of a shovel burying the dead, when my eyes had seen the truth of a woman's unwavering resolve. Inside the small, sparsely furnished house, the silence was heavy, punctuated only by the soft rustle of fabric as we gathered what little we would take. A single satchel for me, a small canvas bag for Maribel, a few changes of clothes, a blanket, some dried meat, and hardtack. Practical necessities stripped of sentimentality. The few possessions that remained in the house felt alien, tied to a life that no longer existed. Maribel moved with an unnerving efficiency, her gaze sharp, assessing. She picked up a small, chipped porcelain doll from a dusty shelf, a relic from a simpler time. Her fingers brushed its painted face for a moment, a fleeting flicker of something unreadable in her eyes before she set it back down, leaving it behind. The past, she knew, was an anchor, not a compass. Just as the first slivers of golden light began to pierce the darkness, painting the eastern sky in hues of rose and violet, we stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant pine. The world was waking oblivious to the profound shift that had occurred within these two souls. I closed the door behind us, a soft click that resonated with the finality of a chapter closing. I did not look back at the small house that had been my sanctuary, my prison, my battleground. My gaze was fixed forward on the dusty track that stretched out before us, an unmarked path into an unknown future. There was no hesitation in my stride, only a quiet, resolute determination. Maribel, however, paused on the threshold, her eyes sweeping over the landscape one last time. She looked at the house, a testament to the terror she had endured and the desperate fight for survival. She looked at the faint, disturbed earth where Mason, Clyde, and Ree lay buried, a silent promise of silence kept. Her gaze drifted to the distant mountains, sharp against the softening sky, a symbol of a world she had never truly belonged to. A world that had offered her no protection until I had broken its rules. It was a silent farewell, not of regret, but of release, a final internal acknowledgement of the woman she had been and the woman she had become. The scars on her skin, once a mark of their cruelty, now felt like a map of her resilience, a testament to her survival. She turned her shoulders squared and followed me. We walked away from the house, away from the ranch, away from the shadows that had clung to us like a shroud. The road was a ribbon of red dust under the nascent light stretching endlessly towards the horizon. The vast untamed land of the American West opened before us, offering anonymity and endless possibilities. We carried no heavy burdens, no expectations, only the raw, visceral truth of who we were. I, the rancher who had found his true sermon in action, and Maribel, the survivor who had found an unlikely ally. Not in salvation, but in shared defiance. Our steps were measured, synchronized, two solitary figures against the immense canvas of the West. The past was buried, the ranch abandoned, and the only certainty was the endless road ahead, a path forged in blood, and quiet resolve leading us into a new, uncertain dawn. We were free, unbound by the roles we once played, now simply two people forging a destiny born of fire and truth. The story of Gideon Thorne and Maribel Kane is more than a tale of survival in the untamed West. It carries timeless lessons about humanity and the choices we make. It reminds us that faith in human goodness can be shaken, yet compassion and courage can endure, even when the world around us grows cold. Sometimes protecting a truth or defending someone vulnerable means stepping outside the safety of familiar boundaries, accepting the cost, and facing real danger. Life does not always allow us to keep our hands clean. At times, decisive action is the only way to preserve our conscience. For older generations, it is also a reminder that loneliness and weariness do not mean one's value has faded. Even when it feels as though we have lived long enough to see everything, there can still be moments that demand we rise, stay, and do what is right. In those moments, dignity is no longer found in fine words, but in steadfastness and quiet, deliberate action. The kind that may seem small, yet has the power to change the course of another person's life forever. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.